Welcome, Barkha. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Madhu.
Congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
It is absolutely riveting.
Thank you.
We go straight into it. I wanted to ask you, how did you decide on the structure? It's very unusual that you've really gone not chronologically, but rather on subjects and back and forth all the time. So you've done a chapter on women, on Kashmir, of course, which you are really quite obsessed with, war coverage, and terrorism. Now, your chapter on women, which I found absolutely riveting, you wrote about Bhavari Devi's rapists.
Yeah.
2 are dead now, and it's 20 years since her case has been languishing in court.
Yeah.
And you also wrote about how your class has protected you from the oppressive gender of caste oppression. Now, tell me about this, that you grew up in a rather liberal household.
In a liberal household that I took for granted. I think I didn't realize till much later how free I actually was, even compared to other young women from my own class. I think I had very unusual parents. The question, when are you getting married, has never been asked of me. Yes, there was some of, are you sure it's safe to come back on your own in that DTC bus?
Of course.
There was that. But I think I did not realize that I had not actually felt the sort of fears or the vulnerabilities that not just people from another class, but certainly people from a less elite social background experience every day. And that made my initial formulations on feminism somewhat simplistic.
And you were at this Tina Brown's Women's Agenda.
Yes.
You were on a panel
Yes.
with Smriti, no, not with Smriti Irani. You were there before her.
Yes.
And then she spoke afterwards.
Yes.
And she spoke about the fact, she said, when she was booed,
Yes.
that women are free to do whatever they like in India.
Yeah.
They can wear what they like, whatever.
Yes.
And what was shocking to me, that someone in a public position would take her personal experience as the universal. When someone in her position should be more aware of the women who did not have the advantage of getting what she experienced. Now, you were on that panel and you disagreed with most of what the women were saying, and you took umbrage of this mother-in-law day. Tell me about it. You really didn't speak much there because you had to give others a chance, but I'm giving you that chance now, what you really wanted to say.
So 2 different things there. One on Smriti's comments. You know, it was interesting. I interviewed her 2 days after that conference, and I asked her the same. And I said, you know, you may have felt that personal freedom. And she turned around and said, haven't you? And I said, yes, I may have. But we have to recognize that we're exceptions, and that when we speak, you know, as women in public positions, even me as a journalist, we have to be mindful that the majority of women do not have that freedom. So I think that is what I think. But on that panel, what was really disturbing to me is that we were discussing women in the workplace. And there was actually a representative, a very senior executive from General Electric, I think, and she spoke of how there was a mother-in-law's day at their office to basically make mother-in-laws understand what their daughter-in-laws did, in the hope that daughter-in-laws would not be harassed when they went back home. And I just said that you have just perpetuated every worst stereotype here. 1, you've perpetuated the stereotype about mother-in-laws. 2, you have actually perpetuated the stereotype that women at the workplace do need extra corseting in a way that men don't. And yes, you can say that women at work will never be equal unless there's equality at home. And yes, we can all appreciate a larger support system of family and friends. But a mother-in-law's day just for women at work, I found the idea actually abhorrent. I actually thought it was sexist, and it was being dished out as this liberal new age idea. So I was really disturbed to hear that.
Now, you have written about your that you were molested as a child, and what really gripped me was you wrote, ridden with guilt, unable to shake off the feeling of being dirty and trapped in a sink of fear, I finally told my mother something terrible had happened. Now, how long did it take you to tell her? Was it a couple of days or that same day?
I think a few days. A few days.
And the man was still around?
The man was living in our house at that time. He was a guest in our home. And he was this elder or sort of older relative, very distant relative, who would come to stay over because he needed a place to stay. So he was in the guest room. And I instinctively trusted him as a child, as one does with, relatives. And he was playful and, as I've written, would twirl us around and take us for piggyback rides and would say, come with me. And that is how, as I said, I ended up being taken to his room to play with him. And something, I didn't really understand what was happening, but it felt intuitively very scary and sickening at the same time. But I felt I had done something wrong. Why had I gone to play with this man? Why had I trusted him? And I felt scared that if I spoke about it, I would be scolded because I had done something wrong. Mm-hmm. And then finally, in some inarticulate, incoherent way, I told my mother what had happened. And he was thrown out like that exact same moment. Mm. And then I put it away and I think my mother tried to speak to me about it, of course, but after that, I put it away and I never revisited it till I wrote this book. So it was really, I wrestled with it because I think I did not want to confront that memory. But then I felt that how can I talk about women and sexual abuse and violence and encourage women to speak as we do on television all the time, but not have the guts to first speak myself. I would have felt like too much of a hypocrite to not write what I did.
So it took courage to write it, actually, to face it again.
It was difficult. It really was difficult.
You also wrote about a relationship you had in college, your first boyfriend, which turned out to be violent.
No, not my first boyfriend.
Okay.
In post-graduation at Jamia, which was my master's master's degree at the Mass Communication Center, a brief relationship. First boyfriend and I had parted ways by then. First boyfriend was a little earlier. And this man he used to slash his wrists with a blade and sit there and then smoke a cigarette and look at me in this sort of cold withering gaze. And I knew I was being manipulated because the first violence was self-inflicted on him. Mm-hmm. And I knew that was, my mind, I was old enough to know this is an act of severe manipulation and get out of this. But as I write, that day, I think I was so scared, when I saw him doing this, that I suddenly started, guilt is so, this thing of internalizing that it's your fault. Once again, I started feeling, okay, why is he slashing his wrist? Like, have I done something terrible? And it was so scary. But better sense prevailed. And the next day I went back and I said, I do not want to be with you. And we're done. And then, he pinned me to the ground. He tried to sexually force himself. And I describe at length what happens in the book. And this time I went to faculty, I went to lawyers, I wanted to take it to the police, but everybody advised me not to. And they said that you're just going to spend the rest of your life doing this. And I think it was my first encounter with how difficult it is. Even if you're empowered and privileged and know your mind, as I did by then, how difficult it is to actually do what you think ought to be done, which is to legally pursue this. Mm. And I did not, because I went to a lawyers collective. I told them what had happened. I went to my faculty, said I will not work with this guy and I think you should take action against him. And they said, on what basis? There were no sexual harassment guidelines at this point. There were no, universities had no rules to even deal with these things.
It was even worse in our generation. Because
I can imagine.
Forget about faculty not reacting. One couldn't even go to the faculty.
Yes.
It was something, it was just unheard of. You were just suppressed on that.
Yeah.
So finally you put it behind you.
What else could I do? I tried. I went public with it. I did not keep it hidden.
And you didn't get a very supportive atmosphere amongst your...
No, it was a very small group. And I discovered this had happened to 2 other women. And even then, they were not willing to sort of go public with it. And the faculty was actually quite progressive. But they were advising me in a friendly way that you're just going to have to put this behind you because otherwise you'll just be spending the next 2 years of your life pursuing a case that's going to go nowhere.
Mm-hmm. Now, moving on to your coverage of the war.
Yes.
And a passage that really gripped me was, which I will just remind you of.
Yeah.
You wrote, from his experience at the helm in 1999, General Malik argues that the effectiveness of a nuclear deterrent depends on the threshold. And the threshold is very dynamic. In other words, in a future conflict between India and Pakistan, if either country were to cross a certain threshold, nuclear confrontation becomes a very real danger. Every point of near war between India and Pakistan after the Kargil conflict has been white flagged by American pressure. But the future cannot trust the consistency of past patterns. There are no guarantees that Western intervention will be timely the next time. And there will be a next time. So this fear of a nuclear war you perceive as very real.
I do. I do not accept this theory that the very presence of nuclear weapons on either side of the border when it comes to India and Pakistan has created a deterrence that is strong enough to prevent nuclear conflict. One hears of that in the Kargil context, that Musharraf gambled on the fact that India would never really go to a full-blown war because it would become nuclear and the Americans would always step in to prevent it. But I do also write in this book, which has not been disclosed before, that had American pressure to not prevailed in the end, and had the war on the battlefield not taken the direction it did, in which India was able to successfully reclaim vast tracts of territory, the army was actually working on a 6-day war plan to open up another war front, for example, hypothetically in Punjab, and very actively considering that they may need to cross the border. Because if they couldn't get out the Pakistanis in Kargil, they would have had to open another battlefront somewhere else. And then who's to tell? Who's to tell, especially given the volatility in Pakistan? Who's to tell that somebody one day will not put their finger on the nuclear button? Are we going to continue to say that the Americans will hold back Pakistan every time? I think India would be much more considered in its response, but I'm not so sure. And now you have a former CIA analyst actually writing about the fact that Pakistan did consider the deployment of nuclear weapons. And I write about an interview I did with Rajesh Mishra, where he said that India basically made it clear to the Americans that do not assume that nuclear deterrence will prevent this war from going further, and then all bets are off the table. We are not going to compromise national interest at the altar of the fears of nuclear war.
So actually, when we talk about it being a deterrent, the fact is that if, particularly in Pakistani hands, where the government is always has been unstable, and the button could be in anyone's hands.
Yeah.
If you compare it to, say, a suicide bomber, if a bunch of people, Islamists, are willing to give up their lives, they're also willing to give up thousands of lives in their own country regardless.
Yes, and I think isn't that evident by now? I mean, the fact of the matter is that you have a school in Peshawar being blown up. There is no humanity that is guiding these decisions. These people are not loyal to countries or people, or even their own.
You've written about how the coverage of the war changed you, and how what a different perspective you had before you went. Could you talk about that?
I mean, in my mid-20s, or a little older than that, when I went to the war front, I had no exposure to the military before that, other than a little bit in reporting from Srinagar. And like everybody else, I think I understood courage and bravery to be, they were just slogans. They were slogans that we used automatically without understanding what went into actually constructing courage, and how vulnerability never went away, even in moments of deep valor. And these soldiers I met, almost all of them were younger than me. They were in their early 20s. And I think for the first time, I saw them as people, not statistics. People with names, with lives, with families, with loves, with broken engagements. The number of men I met whose engagements had broken because the women's families believed they were going to die. So they wanted that engagement to break before the marriage took place. And I got into arguments with them. Who do you fight for? Do you fight for an idea? Do you fight for the country? Do you fight for your Paltan? Did you choose this conflict? I mean, you're basically talking to people in the middle of a conflict that was not of their making. And it changed me because I understood war in a way that I never would have had I not been at the front line. But I also understood the cost of war. I understood the cost of war. And I think when we sit in our drawing rooms and our TV studios and we get hyper-nationalist, and we think we're respecting the soldier, we're doing exactly the opposite. Because we do not want jingoism to create a situation where more young men are sent in to die. So when we claim that we're doing this out of love for our military, we're doing exactly the opposite. I don't want to see another young man having to die because hyperbolic hysteria guided that decision. Yes, of course, there will be conflicts that have to be fought. Kargil was a necessary war. But let there be no unnecessary wars. Let there be no unnecessary
This
conflict.
was the first war that was actually played out on television.
Yes.
I think because of Lieutenant General Arjun Ray, who
Yes,
took a stand
yes.
that it should be,
Yes.
people should know what happens.
Yes.
And the first time coffins were shown.
Yes.
Which I think actually brought it home, as you're saying. But did you, in your encounters with soldiers, did you find them to be jingoistic at all?
Not at all. Not at all. I found them to be, to show the capacity for reflectiveness in conversation even in the middle of a war. And of course, they kept the morale of their troops up by, with the Ye Dil Mange More, and they had raw courage. But they were not jingoistic in the sense of being unthinking. They were not blind or unthinking. They were aware of the complexities of the situation, of the difficulties. And they, more than anybody else, I think, would have wanted a sustainable peace process. So they did not have to die in their 20s. I mean, I think jingoism is on behalf of the soldier. I've rarely met a jingoistic soldier.
In the hotel facing the river, where
Yes.
all the journalists were staying during
Yes.
Kargil, there was an argument every night
Yes.
about, do we report everything that we see? And there were many stories that were suppressed, that were not, there was self-censorship, because people felt that it would be against national interest to report stories about certain things that the army had done. Do you think that that is right?
I do. I think maybe some stories 40, 50 years later could be revisited when their protagonists are not still in play. I think it's very important that in these matters, when you write the unvarnished truth about something or little things that you may have seen but you've held back on, because you actually believe that it would jeopardize an ongoing operation or a decision or break somebody's confidence who's still in a position of authority. I do believe it's an inevitable decision that all journalists take in all countries, in all wars that are reported. It comes with the opportunity of being allowed to report that conflict. You do not go in there to jeopardize the interests of your country. And I'm by no means a jingoist. I've often been called exactly the opposite. But I care very deeply about the military and the interests of India. And I think a little bit of self-censorship by all journalists is an inevitability in times of war. No other context, in times of war.
You were accused after the Kargil War of all kinds of things, of giving locations away with your satellite phone. And but here you do write. You said the Indian Army was about to mount a final assault on Tiger Hill. Just an hour earlier, I'd been holding my satellite phone up to the sky to try and bring it into signal range. I'd been desperately trying to get word to the news desk in Delhi about the imminent assault that when I was pulled into the bunker by a total stranger. Now, would you be reporting on an imminent assault? Should you be? You're warning the enemy.
No, the reason I do not see it as warning the enemy is because the assault was already underway, in the sense that the Pakistani infiltrators who were perched on top of Tiger Hill were already being bombed. That bombing had begun. So it was no secret that the Indians were basically, that the next peak that they were focusing on was Tiger Hill. It was not an operational secret. It was a detail of the war that I was trying to ferry across to Delhi, but it was a detail of the war that the Pakistanis were already witnessing, because the bombing was taking place in front of my eyes.
But the timing of the assault was they weren't aware of, I would imagine.
No, but I think if you have the peak being bombed, it was already being softened by the Air Force by this time. Air bombs had been deployed to basically drop bombs on the top of Tiger Hill. So the Pakistanis knew that Tiger Hill was being bombed. So I did not see this as an operational secret at all. And in fact, later, when I came back and I heard this accusation, the army chief called me for a cup of tea. And he was very, very encouraging and supportive. And I asked him in a sort of small voice that, sir, I've heard, did I give away anything? Did you think that at any point I reported something that was harmful? Because I'd like to know, did I make an inadvertent mistake? And he assured me that I absolutely hadn't done anything, but actually be a force multiplier for the army. And yet till this date, Madhu, I get these, I mean, it's bizarre. I'm quoting the army chief, okay, don't believe me, believe him, but I'll still get these questions thrown at me. And it's, you know, people say, do you care about what's said on Twitter? And I say, well, 9 times out of 10, I don't. But when I'm accused of something like this, it really does deeply hurt. Sometimes it angers. Because I have, as a young woman in my 20s, gone to the army chief and said, sir, please tell me, have I done anything? Have I said or done anything that endangered any soldier, any operation? And I have it from him that I did not. And I choose to believe him.
Also, during the Mumbai siege, you were accused of the same thing.
Yes.
Now, all the channels were showing pretty much everything, even guests climbing out of windows.
Yes.
And I would think that that was a mistake, in the sense that we had not really been trained or been given any instructions. The media had not been given instructions on what to show, what not to show, whether there should be a delayed broadcast. Nothing. It was, everyone was at a loss and everyone was just going wild, showing everything.
Yes.
And I would imagine showing guests escaping would be potentially damaging, because a handler could inform them that you know, from the southwest window these people are, and they could go and shoot all the people trying to escape. So what do you think should be done? What kind of structure should be put in for journalists to prevent that kind of thing from happening, so that we do give the story, but we don't help the enemy?
I agree with you. I actually see my experience in Kargil and Mumbai completely different. In Kargil, I will not accept that I did anything at all, not even one little thing that I need to reflect more on. Mumbai was a learning experience. Mumbai, all of us, the entire industry, we did make inadvertent errors because we did not understand, and maybe we should have without anybody telling us, that there were handlers in Pakistan actually monitoring this through television news. And I think it was only 48 hours into the siege that on the last day, I remember at NDTV we started a 15-minute deferred feed. But before that, it was live. And I could say I wish anybody in the government had called us, and that's all it would have taken. But I also think we should have been wiser on our own. Maybe we should have thought it through more. I do think the industry as a whole did make a mistake. And immediately after that, the self-regulating guidelines came into being, headed by Justice J.S. Verma, the self-regulation committee. And thereafter, now there's a rule that all industry follows, that we do not show any encounter, even a terror encounter, which previously, by the way, to Mumbai, terror encounters in Kashmir were broadcast live to the extent that the media could get access to them, because there were no handlers. There was no dimension of handlers in another country. It was a localized conflict and people would telecast it.
The saddest was watching the commandos come in, which obviously the
handlers were able to see.
Yeah, and the terrorists inside wouldn't know until the handlers told them and warned them. So that was, I think, a huge mistake, showing that. And I'm amazed that the government was asleep, that they were watching it on television. It should have occurred to someone.
It should have been 1 hour. It should have been 1 hour into the conflict that somebody should have called and said, stop telecasting it live. And I remember a fax coming from some Ministry of Information and Broadcasting after 3 days. A fax. I mean, what did it take? It took one phone call to 10 editors. And that's all that was needed. Not one of us would have argued with that. But I have to accept that it was a learning for the industry, for all of us.
And you've written about this rage against the media.
Yes.
After 26/11.
Yes.
And my reading is that I think you've misread that rage. I think the rage was not, basically you said that it was largely the poor of India who were the targets of terrorism. Middle class India had never complained about how we reported these crises, but 26/11 was too close to the bone in a way, that it would never have been had, say, only CST. I remember you said that it was a class sort of thing. That
I guess what I could not understand is why this rage had never been expressed earlier. For example, we were asked, why did people interview the relatives of those who were waiting outside? I remember Sabina Saikia's husband walking up to where I was standing and saying, can I please say something on your show? Because just in case she's watching television inside, maybe I can get my message across. For a number of people, it was also a way of, it was also a release, it was cathartic, it was desperate. It was, we want this moment to be recorded because we don't know if this person we love is going to come out again. And as long as mics are not being shoved and relatives are not being followed, and certainly I did none of that, I'm a bit confused as to why this rage was not witnessed earlier in previous terror encounters. And I haven't yet found any other answer, so I've tried to locate it within class. If there's another theory, I'm very happy to be persuaded otherwise.
Well, you know, one, it was a longer, larger siege. It was
Yes.
far more impactful than any other terrorist attack. That's one point. And secondly, there have been members of people who died, family members who died, who said that I was calling the police and calling bureaucrats in government saying, please stop this coverage, my wife is in there, and nobody was listening. So I think a large part of the rage was that it was affecting operations. And the rage was that us journalists should have been more aware of the impact of what we were doing.
So on the operations aspect of live coverage, I already accept that. On the other dimensions, because some of the questions that came our way were, why did you interview relatives? I don't agree with that. If somebody wants to speak, why should we not talk to them? You know, it's unless someone can once again provide an operational reason. So, for example, if you can say to me that you're interviewing this relative at this point is actually harming his wife, his daughter, his brother inside, yes. But if somebody says, I want to talk about my wife because I don't know if I'll meet her
No, I
again.
don't think they're talking about the relatives. I think they're talking about the actual coverage. That's why the rage was there. That even now, as you say, that we should have thought it through.
I do agree with that.
And,
I accept that. I accept it was a big learning.
Now, a lot of the stories which don't come out when you're doing the story, such as you wrote about a story when you were with Deepak Chaurasia in Gujarat and you were slapped. Now, the viewers never know what you've been through to it. You had to climb through a window and a drain pipe to escape a crowd.
Yeah.
Most average viewers will not know what goes into chasing a story, getting a story, talking to people, getting there. Every interview is an adventure with a politician trying to get him to talk or whatever. In Gujarat, the story that now you've talked about extensively in your book as well as otherwise, that Narendra Modi does not give you an interview because he's been upset with you about your coverage in Gujarat. Now, from his point of view, what he said was that when the riots were going on, he called you and said that please stop this coverage because you were standing next to a small little, what they have on a roadside, like not a temple, but a small little sort of a shivling or something, a little Hanuman thing, which had been desecrated. And you were reporting that and giving locations. And he said that he called you and Rajdeep and said to please stop giving locations and stop giving this reportage because he's trying to bring calm. And he said that you ignored it.
Okay. Is this the Madhu Kishwar interview? I don't know, because I've also only, when I read about him having said this or this being attributed to him by Madhu Kishwar, and I tweeted her saying that I have never received a call from Mr. Modi in my life. During the riots, I was a reporter. I had no editorial role. I had no editorial position. I do not know if he had a conversation with Rajdeep. I can't speak for Rajdeep. I absolutely received no phone call from Mr. Modi. I think the reference also to this temple, if I'm not wrong, what I read on Twitter was that it was in Surat, and I never went to Surat. So I never went to Surat. That's what I remember reading. I never went to Surat. I was never near a temple. I was never near a shivling or a Shiv ki murti.
Would you have done anything differently?
And just to complete, I never received a call from Mr. Modi. So if he called Rajdeep, I do not know. But I had no conversation with Mr. Modi, and nor am I aware that he had any such conversation with anybody else in the editorial structure of my office who could have passed it down to me. So I don't even know what this is about. This didn't happen.
Would you have done it differently in any way, looking back?
The only thing which I think I write about it, the only thing I was not fully sure of was the visuals that you display in a live feed sometimes, and worry that they could cause violence or they could perpetuate violence in another district. So, for example, I write that I was actually driving from Baroda to Godhra and covering and reporting on that highway, and there were factories burnt down. And we stopped to film the factories burnt down. There were no policemen anywhere. There was nobody in sight except for the victims, as it were, of the riots. And there was a page, a half-charred page, which we didn't even notice was a page from the Quran. And as Jami, my cameraman, was shooting, he shot everything, as cameramen do. And we then stopped. We were not telecasting live. We then uplinked this footage. And in the next bulletin, in that collection of montage of pictures, this page went in. And I remember calling and saying, this has gone on air and I'm really worried about this image. We need to pull this off. We need to pull this off because maybe it'll have a consequence somewhere else. And those were the things that I think one can always go back and say, that image, was it necessary? Be a little more circumspect about the power of the image. But other than that, the tone and tenor of my reporting, I think I reflected the stories of the victims as I met them. And I certainly would have been very happy to get the response of the administration. But as always happens in these situations, nobody in the administration at that time is ready to talk to you.
And you had a tough time getting out of there because Jami is Muslim.
Jami is Muslim.
And
we lied about his religion.
Yeah. And that would have been a really tough...
They were stopping cars and asking people their religion. And they were standing there with petrol bums at our car window and long sticks, and we had to say, we made up a fictional name for Jami. I don't apologize for how I reported the riots. Like every story, there's always something you could have done differently, and there's always something you learn, and I am sure that maybe there were moments I was too shrill, maybe I could have been a little more even-toned. But I feel that about every story. But overall,
You've been more shrill in Kashmir, by the way.
Yes, I'm sure. Because you're not always conscious of which pitch you're talking at, or even with experience, it's never perfect. But I don't regret how I reported the riots.
You wrote, Advani was blamed for his role in the demolition of the Babri Masjid in 1992, and Modi was held accountable for the Gujarat riots of 2002 that happened on his watch.
Yes.
It's notable that you don't say he was responsible.
Because there is a difference. Because Advani was leading a movement to build a temple at the place where the mosque stood. And therefore, there was a direct connection between the demolition of the mosque, even though Advani called it the saddest day of his life, and his his Ayodhya movement. It was a declared position. He wanted something else to be where the mosque stood. I believe that the riots happened on Modi's watch, which raise questions of moral responsibility, of why could your administration not do more to contain this? Why was your police missing? Why was the administration permitting things? I've spoken about marches that the administration permitted that they had to know would have been inflammable. Feedback from Intelligence Bureau that was ignored. But it was not a stated position of Mr. Modi that it's okay to have these riots happen. It was a stated position of L.K. Advani, a political position, that this mosque is not a mosque. So I think that explains the difference in my usage of the words.
And wasn't this Shahid Siddiqui and Rajesh Pilot's idea of lifting a dome with a chopper and bringing it and putting it on top of what Babri Masjid used to be? Wasn't it kind of ludicrous? Didn't you laugh when you...
I would love to hear a little more from Shahid, and I told him that I would love to do a deeper dive into this, because I didn't really understand what he meant. And I kept asking him, where was this dome going to come from? Where was this other mosque? Where was this dome going to be procured from? But he kept arguing that, his emphasis was that the mosque must remain a mosque, and we have to rebuild it as a mosque. And otherwise, it'll forever be the disputed structure. It'll get into that politics. And I think he was telling me that story more to make the point that Narasimha Rao was just not willing to help in any way, to make the point that the Congress has also moral responsibility for the demolition of the mosque.
You write at length, and I think this is the first time that anyone has written about this change of the elite.
Yeah.
and you write about Wright Mills, who wrote about the power elite. Now, hasn't Modi now created his own elite with favored journalists, favored channels, favored corporates? Isn't it the same thing? Isn't it a bit like the Soviet Union, who was doing it all for the people, and then they became the power, and you see it in various countries, and now we see that, okay, the English-speaking urban, that old club has broken down, fine, but then we have a new club, which is just as exclusive and just as arrogant. And
I do agree. I mean, I may be more circumspect in the words that I use because I still have to be a reporter, but the essence of what you're saying is right. I think there was something very, very powerful in Modi, the son of the tea vendor, a self-made politician, in contrast to the political entitlement of a Rahul Gandhi. It was so powerful. And somewhere along the way, the shutting out of so many people, you know, even journalistically, the shutting out because you don't like the media. Why? What happened to being the ordinary person's government and being open and accessible and not being, okay, you're not the Delhi that was, and that was, you know, dominated by an old elite that also shut out people.
yeah, I mean, Sonia, Rahul Gandhi.
I agree.
How many Manmohan Singh? How many interviews did they do?
I agree.
They were as uptight about journalists and the media.
I agree.
And far more repressive in their means of putting, you know, Section 66A and banning books and banning movies and banning people and all that kind of thing. Didn't support Salman Rushdie being told not to come to Jaipur and not protecting. They have a worse record than the BJP government.
Well, they've been in power for longer, and certainly their record on censorship is absolutely abysmal. There is no doubt about that. But I do feel that while the Gandhis were inaccessible, I think Mr. Modi actually believes, I'm not sure because I don't know him particularly well, so this is my analysis.
He says hello to you.
He says hello to me and that's all he says. That's pretty much all he said, except for one other brief conversation that we've had. He believes he doesn't need any media. He believes, mainstream media. I think he believes that he's bypassed mainstream media and can talk directly to the citizen.
But he said that in the first week or so when he became Prime Minister. He said the media is not going to write the agenda, we are.
But is that what's happening? I mean, at the moment, isn't it kind of needless to paint? Yes, every media should have a slightly adversarial relationship with any government. Mm-hmm. But to paint the media or sections of the media as personal enemies of the BJP, you know, wherein others in the government then become, who are much more accessible actually individually, become fearful that they, you know, that the top man will disapprove of even them, even them being open. This is a new phenomenon.
And closing the door to any kind of scrutiny or policy examination or whatever before it's done.
No, even when you're on India's side and you travel, you know, we're all on India's side. And when we travel abroad, we travel as Indian journalists. I have been on 2 trips that the Prime Minister has made abroad. Other than the Joint Secretary for External Publicity in the Ministry of External Affairs, almost nobody talks to you on or off. I don't just mean me. Nobody talks to the media. I don't know if there are 1 or 2 journalists they like and they talk to them. But generally the media contingent who travel now on their own, and I think that's a fine thing that you pay for the ticket and you don't take an Air India freebie. But, you know, if there's an India-Pakistan meeting happening, there was a time when the National Security... Okay, so the Gandhis never spoke to anybody either. But the National Security Advisor would, you know, somebody, there will be a Principal Secretary to the Prime Minister would. There were people who sat you down.
Gave the information, yeah.
Or gave you at least India's point of view. Okay, forget other kinds of stories. At least when it involves other countries, talk to us. Why don't you talk to us? I mean, it's become so frustrating to cover a Prime Minister's trip because nobody talks to you. So you're basically dependent on press conferences. And that's not journalism.
You've written about your relationship with Sunanda and Shashi Tharoor that grew strained because of your interview with him.
Yes.
He said what he wanted to say. But because of the fallout,
yes,
it was not what he expected and it was bad. Then he blamed you,
yes,
which is a very common phenomena
yes,
with
any politician,
anybody.
Yeah.
That you do an interview, they do it happily, they say what they want, you don't tell them to say what they want.
Yeah.
And then when there's a fallout, they say it was because of your interview,
yes,
and then they
yes,
sort of mentally blame you. It's also a kind of an agreement you make with the person you're interviewing that, look, you're going to say what you want, but I'm going to ask whatever I want.
Course.
And it's a very tenuous sort of relationship.
It's very tenuous.
But you've been able to maintain a pretty fair amount of relationships where you do get your interviews, you do get what you want. But it's a risk that you take when you ask an aggressive question.
Yes.
And for example, with Musharraf, you've written out how you wanted to let him have it.
Yeah.
But you didn't. You kept your cool, kind of. And one of the things I mentioned to you was that you did not ask him the question of, where do you get the money to live like this?
Yes.
With all,
Yes.
in 4 years of ultimate luxury.
Yes.
Were you controlling yourself, or you just didn't think of it?
No, that was a question I should have asked and didn't. Sometimes your mind just slips up on a question.
Now, lastly, the elephant in the room has always with you, that especially on social media, are the Radia tapes.
How is it an elephant in the room? It's the most talked about, deconstructed question. I even went on television to talk about it. It's hardly the elephant in the room.
In the sense that when I'm doing an interview, this will come out as, why are you doing Barkha? What about the Radia tapes and this and that? What I did want to bring up, just to clear it, was that I remember speaking to you at that time, saying that I think you mismanaged it. Because as I saw it, what I heard on the tapes was something that all of us journalists do. We talk to people, we talk sweetly to them, we talk them up, we lead them on.
And we lie a bit also.
To get this...
The information.
Yeah, to get the sauce rolling,
Yes.
and to get your interview and to get more information, which I thought is very normal. And then, in fact, which I felt that which you did not do, was that in your program that you did to defend yourself on NDTV, you did not point out to the fact that the stories that you did on Raja were actually the opposite of what you were speaking to Neera Radia about.
No, I did, but nobody wanted to listen to those bits. You know, before that television program, I put up a written statement on the website, and I attached 15 stories that I had done on 2G, on the telecom scam, and my final story was on how Manmohan Singh did not want Raja in the cabinet, and how the relationship between the DMK and the Congress had actually ruptured over this man, and why Manmohan Singh actually had wanted nothing to do with him. So it was the exact opposite of what I was later accused of. If I wanted to lobby for this man whom I've never met in my life, would my reportage be all about him not being...
But the noise around it and that program that you did was so off point from what your actual facts were.
You know, I do write in the beginning of this book that I actually, people ask me, do you have any regrets of how you handled it? And somebody asked me this recently, and I said my only regret is that I over-explained myself instead of just saying, let my story speak for itself. The story is the test.
So the learning experience was that, because frankly, Veer Sanghvi wrote the article that Neera Radia dictated.
But my story speaks for itself.
Yeah, so it was actually the opposite.
There is nothing in my
So you
reportage.
mismanaged your defense, actually. You mismanaged...
By over-explaining myself.
Yes.
I agree.
By getting too noisy, in fact, as noisy as the accusers.
I think I got too upset and angry.
Yeah.
I never faced anything like this before. I was appalled at what, my integrity being questioned, because people can love and hate me, but I've never done one dishonest thing in my life. And I should have just said, here's my story. And is this called lobbying for a minister? Here's my story. And that's all I should have been done. I agree.
And finally, the program that you did on NDTV about your book, would you not call that kind of a conflict of interest? That you do a program on your own book with the scoop given to Hindustan Times, with the guy sitting over there, and you're saying, so you got this scoop, and you're doing a full program on yourself.
Okay, so this is a really interesting question, because I actually would have preferred another anchor to do that program. We were not even planning to do the program. So the backstory to this is that the print tie-up between the publisher and the Hindustan Times was something worked out by the publisher. The Hindustan Times on its own picked up the Sergeant Jindal and the secret meeting story, front-paged it, and there were reactions to it. The next day, Imran Khan held a press conference in Pakistan, the Congress held a press conference here, and NDTV, that had no intention at all of doing anything on the book at that time. They may pick up something later based on the launch, but at that time there was no plan, called me and said, we're losing out on the advantage of the story because it's in Hindustan Times, and how do we reflect it on our own channel? And I said, wouldn't it be much better if somebody else anchored it, and I can be the reporter on it, I can say what I saw.
That would have been better.
But it was the editorial management's decision that I knew the story best, and I kept saying, I feel a bit awkward about this because...
It was awkward, you shouldn't have done it.
I would agree with you. I would have preferred it somebody else did it, but I think the feeling was that it was too big a scoop to ignore.
But promoting it yourself kills it, I think. It would have been better if, say, Sonia or somebody else. Anyway.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. No disagreements
But the publishers told me that they had made an agreement with Hindustan Times that this would be on the front page with this.
Not the front page. There was no commitment of a front page. They had a print tie-up with the Hindustan Times where they told the Hindustan Times that you may find this more interesting for the news pages than the books pages typically, so have a look at it. And who can get a commitment of where a story would run? And I don't think any paper would promise that. I think they just said, we'll have a look at it, and if it's of interest to us, we'll put it in the news pages. And I was thrilled to get up the next day and find it on the front page.
Okay, so the publishers told me embargo on everything. You can't read the book, you can't see the book, you can't do anything until this appears on the front page of HT.
The front page, I don't know. I think that was a bonus. I don't think anyone gave us any such promise.
Well, thank you very much, Barkha.
Thank you so much.
It was good. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you.
If you enjoyed that, click up here to support us and down here to subscribe. Be sure to check out our older episodes and the other stuff we do, like Can You Take It, I Agree, panel discussions, comics and animations, and much, much more.